hi, during all this Godzilla rampaging, I actually forgot to tell you that I stream on twitch.tv/Jinzy 5 days a week, 4 hours a day. Alright, carry on. If you're here, you probably at least like Godzilla to a certain degree. I've been a Godzilla fan for some time now, and with Godzilla vs. Kong coming out soon, I thought it might be nice to have a look at Godzilla's history for a minute. Or an hour. Whichever. You might have thought that Godzilla has been a staple for the West for as long as it has been for Japan, but the first Western creation for the Godzilla franchise didn't release until 1998, and it was terrible. A terrible, terrible flop that didn't get a remedy until the most recent MonsterVerse reboot. So, where did it start? And how are we doing now? Let's take a look at Godzilla through the ages, and be warned, I will be spoiling the majority of all Godzilla movies ever made, and especially the most recent Shin Godzilla and quote-unquote anime trilogy. And Shin Godzilla is very worth watching, so gather around the fire and let me tell you a tale. I don't think I need to explain who Godzilla is on the baseline level for most people, but just to be as complete as possible, Godzilla is a kaiju. Kaiju meaning strange beast in Japanese, though generally translated as monster in English. Oddly, very few people ever use dai kaiju, where the dai prefix emphasizes that the strange beast is very big or giant monster, because Godzilla most definitely is a giant monster, although not the first. Most people I've asked assume that the giant lizard was the start of the big lads era, but that dubious honor would sooner go to King Kong from 1933, his adversary in the upcoming movie. And even then, The Lost World from 1925 debuted the big monster focus with its stop-motion dinosaur puppets in the silent movie era. Mind you, I say big monster movies because technically the kaiju genre is exclusive to Japan-made movies. And if we're being completely honest, while King Kong is what likely inspired the kaiju scripts initially, with the big beast starring in King Kong Appears in Edo in 1938, Godzilla was the movie that started the absolute madness for a good while. But Godzilla didn't release until 1954, long after quite a few important monster movies, not least of all, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which, when you look at the beast, very much so served as inspiration for the overall design of Godzilla. Really, Godzilla is an upright version of the Rhedosaurus from the Beast movie, down to their origins of rising from the sea. And since we're on the topic of origins, another broadly accepted inspiration for the first Godzilla movie was the Lucky Dragon 5 incident. This was an existing Japanese tuna fishing boat that found itself contaminated by nuclear fallout after the US tested the Castle Bravo thermonuclear weapon at Bikini Atoll in 1954. Yes, an entire H-bomb. This particular one was the most powerful nuclear bomb ever detonated by the US specifically. We don't talk about Russia. The boat had set off on a fishing trip near Midway Atoll initially, but when they lost a good deal of their fishing nets in open sea, they changed course to the Marshall Islands and sailed straight into Castle Bravo's future fallout zone. The US had declared a danger zone for their test, of course, without telling anyone what test exactly, as to keep it a secret, but because the bomb turned out so much more powerful than expected, that danger zone proved to be too small by quite a margin. Not to mention that changes in the weather blew the fallout even further yet. When the bomb went off, the sky lit up like a candle, and while the initial blast didn't damage the Lucky Dragon boat, radioactive particles of coral and sand started settling on the ship after some hours. At that point, the crew decided it was time to leave, still taking 6 hours to retrieve their fishing equipment and process the fish they caught. Protective gear wasn't available, but one of the fishermen, strangely, went as far as licking some of the dust, reporting it reminded him of snow and had a gritty feel with no taste. That was a pretty big explosion! The whole sky lit up! And now it's strange-looking snow. What on earth? We should get out of here immediately. We should lick it. What? We should lick the snow. I really don't think I'm licking the snow. Oh my god, he's licking the snow. The snow has had adverse effects. Little wonder they all suffered heavy radiation sickness. For those unfamiliar with said sickness, which I'd hope is all of us, The symptoms ranged from nausea and fever to hair loss, blistered skin, and bloody vomit. The fishermen dubbed the fallout Shi no Hai, death ash. They had brought home some of the dust to be analyzed, and Japan quickly recognized it as the result of an H-bomb, much to the US's surprise given their secrecy. When Japan reached out for help to the US in how to treat the radiation, they were ignored. Instead, America silently sent 2 scientists to study the boat and fallout and assist the Japanese doctors. The afflicted crew definitely wasn't happy with the way things had gone, accusing Americans of only being here for their own benefit, to collect data. They didn't care to help the crew at all, and the foreign minister, Katsuo Okazaki, was always on the American side. That stung especially because the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings were still fresh in everyone's mind. 1954 was practically yesterday. They called Katsuo the American foreign minister, rather than their own. Eventually, one of the crew members died and the other 22 were released from the hospital. Unfortunately, due to the stigma surrounding radiation in general, many believing it was contagious, those 22 were largely shunned by society. The crew attempted to keep quiet and even moved towns in many cases to start over, to varying success. The majority died of various forms of cancer, and almost all of them dealt with cirrhosis of the liver. The man who licked fallout dust, Oishi, was in fact one of the few people to come out of this successfully to some degree, alongside Susumu Misaki, who opened a tofu shop and died at 92. There seems to be no cure so far. None at all? Madness. Oh, except one, maybe? What? Why would you wait to tell me that? Well, we've no confirmation. Well, selling tofu. Selling tofu. Selling tofu. Extra tofu! Extra tofu! Good tofu! Excellent tofu! While this event received its own movie in 1959, it's no coincidence that it happened the same year as Godzilla's release. In general, Japan was still very much trying to cope with what happened during the war. Even outside of the direct bombings, the fallout, both literally and consequentially. As with most countries torn by war, there were immense food shortages to such an extent that the rationed-out food simply wasn't enough to sustain a person on. One judge, Yoshitada Yamaguchi, was too honest to resort to the black market and ate only what was rationed out. He died of starvation in 1947. Unemployment, inflation, the list goes on. On top of that, Japan was strictly under US occupation from 1945 to 1951, and the US did what it does best: tell Japan they should be more American about it, although they did support Japan financially in exchange. Fun fact, one such way of support were government bonds called the Fukin bonds, which is impressively hilarious to me, and me only. They also introduced Article 9, which basically said Japan will never again do war, and so they can't have any kind of army, and I do mean none. Except then the Cold War started, and suddenly the US was all for Japan going all out on their army exploits to support the US. You can imagine that this amount of shenanigans might have an adverse effect on the general population of Japan. I don't think we have to stretch very far to know that we dislike a foreign country that just dropped 2 gigantic radioactive bombs on our land, telling us how to continue living. And when humanity is upset, they find ways to cope. One such coping mechanism, as is usually the case, was art. And so, Gojira was born, or as he's known in the West, Godzilla. Godzilla was a creation from the mind of mainly Tomoyuki Tanaka, a Toho film producer. One day he was flying across the ocean and wondered about the beast from 20,000 fathoms, and what might happen should a creature that large ever emerge from the sea. But Tanaka didn't just want to make a monster movie, he wanted to share the pain of a nation. While the bombs had been a few years past now, it was still fresh in his mind, and coupled with the incident on the Lucky Dragon 5, nuclear attacks, while feared the world over, were especially threatening to Japan. So, Tanaka decided that this monster should represent those fears. Godzilla would be a living, breathing atomic bomb. Creating Godzilla as a beast took some time, and they went through several iterations, like a giant octopus or mushroom cloud-shaped imaging, before settling on an amalgamation of several big lizards, including the T-Rex, of course. Perfect for terrorizing a nation, even if it was just a man in a suit walking around a miniature city set. Which, looked really cool for this era, by the way. It created the illusion of a gigantic beast marching through Tokyo very well. The movie opens with fishing boats sinking off the coast of Odo, seemingly because of underwater explosions. Initially, people assume it's leftover mines or a volcano, except for one man who blames a monster. The village elder from Odo Island even names Godzilla as the perpetrator, but the other villagers laugh it off until the fishing schools disappear from the island's sea entirely. At that point, the villagers decide on a ritual dance to appease Godzilla, who, in the old times, would rise from the sea to feed on mankind. Girls would be sacrificed to the great lizard to keep it from eating everyone else. Much to their dismay, the dance doesn't work, and Godzilla comes ashore that same night to destroy the village. I guess it's over its dancing and devouring women phase. As researchers flock to the island to confirm a monster attack, they find that the wells on the island show signs of nuclear radiation. Godzilla's footprints near the village are equally radioactive. Just as they write down their findings, Godzilla shows up again to confirm it exists. At this point, the consensus is that Godzilla was a creature formed between the Jurassic and Cretaceous period, like an in-between monster. Recent nuclear explosions had altered its natural habitat, causing the mutations after it's absorbed enormous amounts of radiation. They named the creature Godzilla purely because that was the beast of legend from the Odo Island folklore. Regardless of what the government wants, this information eventually leaks as more ships start to sink and talk of bomb shelters start up again. Depth charges are deployed to destroy the beast, despite objections from the single zoologist who wants to save Godzilla. But depth charges do little to hurt it, so the focus shifts to determining why it's alive at all. A doctor, Daisuke Serizawa, a man scarred by the recent World War, apparently researched a way to destroy Godzilla, but he refuses to talk about it, at least until one of his friends, a woman named Emiko, asks to have a look. He agrees as long as she keeps it a secret. The research, an oxygen destroyer, shakes Emiko to her core, and after another one of Godzilla's destructive visits, this time to Tokyo, Japan decides to evacuate the coastal area entirely and erect a gigantic electric fence in hopes of electrocuting Godzilla when it shows up next time. Around Japan, and for us focused in Emiko's home life, people start to compare Godzilla to the atomic bomb and how much they hate the effect it's had on their lives. When Godzilla appears once again, the electrical wiring does little to nothing, and the rampage through Tokyo begins again. Many people have simply given up on running or fighting and sit helplessly in the streets, awaiting death. Missiles eventually chase Godzilla back into the water, but as atomic breath was used this time as well, many people are dead or radioactive. At this point, Emiko has had enough and betrays Serizawa's secret to her lover, Ogata. A bomb that destroys oxygen. It could immediately asphyxiate anything in the water it was dropped in. Serizawa didn't want to speak of it because when used as a weapon, it would be as powerful as a nuclear bomb. His only hope was to find a way for it to aid mankind in a better way. Because of this, he also refuses to share the research to attack Godzilla, and after a short fight between Serizawa and Ogata, Serizawa explains that should the politicians of the world see his research used even once, they would want to use it in the next war, and the arms race would begin anew. Even if it could kill Godzilla in secret, he wouldn't risk it, for fear the world leaders might force him to explain what happened and construct another bomb. However, when Serizawa sees the destruction wrought by Godzilla on TV, he's convinced to use the weapon this once, burning his notes of the creation first. Ogata and Serizawa dive to the bottom of the sea together to place the oxygen destroyer near Godzilla. Ogata is pulled up again, but Serizawa remains with Godzilla until the bomb explodes, taking both their lives. Serizawa feared making another bomb so deeply, he chose to die and ensure he never could. The movie ends on the lone zoologist noting that this couldn't be the only Godzilla alive, and if nuclear testing continued, surely another would awake. You might have noticed that at no point did I refer to Godzilla as a he or she. That's because in the entire movie, Godzilla is never addressed as such. The King of Monsters thing wasn't introduced until the 1956 movie, where it was used in Toho's advertising campaign. In the original, Godzilla truly is the embodiment of an H-bomb. It has no gender because it is pure destructive force, and the purpose of its existence was to show the monstrous form of a weapon as destructive as a nuclear bomb. Godzilla isn't a threat like a T-Rex from Jurassic Park. A T-Rex hunts and eats and then it leaves. Godzilla has no motive other than destruction. It embodied the fear of the Japanese people regarding the future of nuclear weapons and its fallout. Serizawa, as a character, embodies that fear perfectly. He's almost an Oppenheimer stand-in. Oppenheimer, one of the inventors of the atomic bomb during the Manhattan Project, was fiercely opposed to the creation of the H-bomb after the initial atomic inventions. When he saw the destruction wrought by the first atomic bomb test, he referenced the Hindu scripture, Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." His creation had brought nothing but destruction, and he spent most of his remaining life lobbying for control on nuclear power to prevent a nuclear arms race. He was so opposed, in fact, that the far more bloodthirsty US government and military eventually stripped him of clearance and political influence, which was only partially returned during Kennedy's presidency, although officially awarded by President Johnson due to the assassination. The fact Oppenheimer was somewhat rehabilitated at this point enraged in particular the Republican Party, who were still in favor of nuclear research. The FBI went so far as to even prevent his daughter Toni from gaining security clearance as a UN translator strictly because of her father's position. I tell you all this to emphasize how deep this conflict runs. America has never had to deal with a nuclear disaster of this scope. Their largest nuclear incident was that of 3 Mile Island, which, while disastrous still, isn't comparable to having atomic bombs dropped on major cities, only to have another bomb tested right next door not a few years later. From the perspective of a lot of Americans at the time, nuclear weapons were the perfect deterrent. If we have the biggest, baddest bombs, no one will challenge us, and war will end forever. From the Japanese perspective, these bombs wreak untold destruction, and that damage is lasting. Radiation doesn't dissipate as the dust settled on the initial blast. Furthermore, where does it end? Arms races aren't new to the world if the most powerful weapon available is the atomic bomb and it's actively used to threaten other countries into submission, then what's the next step? What world-destroying weapon will be thought of next? That's what the Godzilla movie started out as, the what if, the next step in atomic destruction. And the movie did very well. It expressed exactly the lingering fear of the war, the way the US interfered with Japan constantly, and the overall distrust remaining from those years. But that was one movie. Where did Godzilla go from there? Over the years, Godzilla has been used in many movies. That's not surprising, given the initial success of the movie, despite talk of how said movie used the atrocities of Japan for profit, but it also spawned copycats by studios other than Toho, Godzilla Studio. And so, each political era of Japan gained some of their own highlights. The Showa era, lasting from 1954 to 1975, saw interesting new films like Nikatu's Death Kappa, with the tagline, "King Kong is dead, Godzilla is retired, a new monster is in town," with a much less subtle story based on Japan taking revenge for World War II. So a scientist combines human and Kappa DNA to create what amounts to the Deep Ones from Lovecraft to serve as the Japanese army. Upon failing, she sets up an atomic bomb which makes the fish people fuse together into a giant fish person a la Dagon, and the titular Kappa also turns gigantic. Said giant Kappa defeats Dagon and then rampages through Japan because humanity does not believe in unconfirmed life forms. You can see why it didn't become as popular as Godzilla. The only character that came close to Godzilla was Gamera, the giant flying turtle, who had a film release as recent as 2006. We need something as big as Godzilla! Giant donkey! Giant blobfish! Giant fusa! Very small donkey. Giant flying turtle. Brilliant. Of course, the other well-performing group would simply be the creations of Toho, Godzilla's own studio. This era saw the birth of a lot of Godzilla mainstays like Mothra, Ghidorah, Rodan, and Mechagodzilla. And in a lot of cases, Godzilla would end up fighting these same monsters, because that's largely what the movies turned into after the second movie, Godzilla Raids Again. It would be followed up by King Kong vs. Godzilla, after Toho bought the rights to the big ape, where King Kong ends up floating to Mount Fuji, carried by a bunch of balloons, so he can fight Godzilla. And after that, Mothra vs. Godzilla, where Mothra defeats the beast by using string shot. But the following movie would finally see Godzilla fight King Ghidorah, a much larger threat to Earth, that requires the combined strength of Godzilla, Rodan, and Mothra to defeat. From this point on, Godzilla is more of a protector than an aggressor. A threat would show up, Godzilla would do something about it, and then the next movie happened. Godzilla even got a son at some point, Minilla, and all the monsters lived together on Monster Island. There were moments here and there concerning some social commentary, like the fight against Hedorah, who quite clearly represents pollution, but it was few and far between. When you look at how each movie is filmed as well, the later movies really have more of a Power Rangers vibe than a scary monster vibe. Godzilla certainly wasn't a horror franchise anymore. And when you look at the rest of Toho's productions, you get the feeling that they were just trying to see what would stick by this point. Several kaiju movies would make your eyes roll out of your sockets these days, like The Invisible Man and Frankenstein. Yes, Frankenstein.
I don't have no cousin.
While the term kaiju is often used in the West to describe monsters from tokatsu and Japanese folklore, monsters like vampires, werewolves, and, yes, Frankenstein's monster also fall into this category when used in these movies. Baragon, a monster that also fought Godzilla at one point, faces off against Frankenstein in a brutal battle. Did they use atomic power to create Frankenstein, you ask? Well, yes, sort of. Frankenstein's heart was taken by the Nazis during World War II and then shipped to Japan so they could study it and make immortal soldiers. Except then the atomic bombs dropped right on top of said heart, which irradiated it into a young boy, Frankenstein. And that boy was supposed to fight Godzilla too at one point in time, but that movie was sadly shelved. Couldn't imagine why. The Showa era was more than a little ridiculous. Once the monsters started having entire conversations in the first Ghidorah movie, someone probably realized that they'd gone too far off the cam scale. Godzilla started doing weird, funny things like dancing, and the terror of 1954 was long gone. Godzilla movies were also produced at an alarming rate, one a year. So it's no wonder that Toho eventually took a hiatus to later reboot Godzilla entirely in the Heisei Era, starting in 1984. Yes, 1984, even though the Heisei Era doesn't actually start until 1989, the Godzilla franchise's reboot started in 1984, so that's how we're summarizing this series. Sumanai. The Heisei Era starts, predictably, with the return of Godzilla. As with most reboots, it's a complete 180 from the movie that came before it. It's dark and gritty, with roots closer to the original, and for that reason, finds more time to provide social commentary than the previous iterations. In fact, in universe, it pretends that the first Godzilla movie is the only existing Godzilla movie, and we go from there. Aptly, it starts with the Yahata Maru 5, a fishing boat, under attack by a giant monster. It's soon confirmed that the monster was Godzilla, but to avoid panic, that knowledge is kept secret. This only leads to the attack on a Soviet nuclear submarine, something the Russians blame the Americans for, and the world once again teeters on the brink of war. This movie is where the concept of Godzilla directly feeding off atomic energy is introduced, as the beast walks off to suck an atomic power plant dry. The usual battles ensue, and eventually Godzilla is defeated by luring him into a volcano surrounded by bombs. There weren't quite as many Godzilla movies in this era as in the Showa era, and the narrative never really switched to Godzilla as a savior again. In this era, Godzilla is more of a force of chaos than anything else. Always a threat, but not necessarily because the beast specifically chose to go rampage around Japan. Alongside Godzilla, the main antagonists are generally the Americans and whichever kaiju is introduced that movie. One of the new introductions is Biolante, a fusion between Godzilla cells and a plant infused with the cells of a scientist's dead daughter. The Godzilla cells in this story are obviously a hot commodity, and several groups are on the hunt for them, eventually resulting in a scene very close to this one.
What's your group doing here? We're gonna kidnap Pilot's wife, take her back, issue demand. So we. What? That's our plan.
If you thought the reboot was going to take things marginally more serious in terms of plot, however, you're going to be disappointed. We have movies with time travelers trying to stop the Godzilla-saurus from ever mutating into Godzilla. We have evil Mothra called Batra who declares war on humanity for trying to control the climate. Mecha King Ghidorah, another Mecha Godzilla who turns into Super Mecha Godzilla. Yet another Godzilla child aptly named Baby Godzilla who imprints on a human woman. It is also revealed that Godzilla has a second brain in its hip. Then Space Godzilla crashes into planet Earth, who Godzilla defeats, and the final Heisei movie is called Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. Yes, very subtle. The Destoroyah were created through the oxygen bomb from the very first movie, bringing the franchise full circle. Godzilla actually dies in this movie, which makes it the second time Godzilla dies at all. Quite an event in the Godzilla franchise in general. Godzilla Jr. is also killed in this same movie, but as Godzilla literally has a nuclear meltdown, the excess radiation is passed onto the corpse of Godzilla Jr., reviving them as a new Godzilla Reborn. The end. At least it would be for about 10 years. Or it should have been, but then America done messed up. We'll talk about that later. After the Destoroyah movie, Toho intended to take a bit of a break from Godzilla to let the West do its thing. But when the 1998 Godzilla movie released, I'm sure they were as disappointed as everyone else, despite the banging soundtrack. So, after only 4 years, Toho released their own Godzilla movie, Godzilla 2000 Millennium, because if you were approaching the 2000s and your movie didn't have 2000 in the title, then I have no idea what you were doing. This is the era during which Godzilla starts to become the force of nature antagonist we largely know him as today. Mostly the beast just goes where it pleases and does whatever it pleases. Although not necessarily rampaging around as such, there's still a lot of chaotic rampaging to be found. It's also notable in large part because the Millennium movies all stood on their own. This wasn't one single storyline. Godzilla 2000's Godzilla was a different Godzilla than Godzilla vs. Mechaguirus. There are only 2 parts that can be considered a pair, and that's Mechagodzilla and Godzilla Tokyo SOS. The Kiryu saga. Honestly, continuity-wise, the Millennium series is a confusing mess, but the movies are still very enjoyable. The world has somewhat accepted that there will always be a Godzilla, and we better live with that. Nevertheless, the movies still have new anti-Godzilla weaponry for every installment, and we largely continue down the Heisei Era path. Yes, that means there's a new big bad in every movie, and humanity chooses to reluctantly side with Godzilla against said big bad because it is the greater threat, usually, and only Godzilla stands a chance at all. The first movie even incorporates the Millennium Scare, for those unfamiliar. Before the year 2000, quite a few people were worried that every computer in the world would have a complete meltdown, dubbed the Millennium Bug or Y2K, because a problem in the coding of most systems would mean that they didn't know how to calculate using the year 2000, thus chaos. That never happened, of course, but they didn't know that yet in 1999. And while not as big of a deal as a nuclear bomb, we did collectively think the world might end that day. And then the computer will shut down and it'll say a funny line? Yeah? Like what line? Like, you know, you didn't say the magic word. What? Do you want to go down the same road as Godzilla 1998? Wait, I thought we were discussing that movie later in the script. Do you? No, sir. So what are we not going to do? Copy Jurassic Park. Attaboy. Go with the Y2K scare or something. Interestingly enough, most of the monsters introduced in the Millennium movies didn't really draw a big audience, nor are they remembered by as many people as, for example, Rodan and Mothra, or even Biolante, like Megaguirus, a giant dragonfly queen whose brood we first saw in the Rodan series. That movie barely made a profit, whereas the follow-up, Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, yes, that's the actual title, and I know it's a mouthful, drew a much bigger crowd. It's not surprising that most current movies seem to stick to the monsters we know, so of course Mechagodzilla came back in a 2-parter, as well as Mothra, and in Final Wars they throw in absolutely every kaiju under the sun. They even bring in Zilla from the Western movie. I guess you get to do that when you don't put your movies in any particular continuous timeline. This movie is basically Invasion of the Astro Monster again from the Showa era, the one where the aliens try to control the monsters to take over Earth, and it did terribly. It's not a bad Godzilla movie by any means. It was a perfectly fine Godzilla movie, but by this point in the series, Godzilla needed to bring something new, and it hadn't. Not to mention that the special effects unfortunately didn't really live up to the expectations of the West. I'm willing to bet that unless you're a Godzilla fan in general, you've never even heard of most of the Millennium Era movies at all. Manila is also reintroduced in this movie. Yes, the Kid Godzilla from the Showa era. I'm not sure if the director just figured that putting a whole bunch of nostalgic Showa-era appearances into this movie would make for a successful script, but in the end, it made the whole thing a little too convoluted. Not to mention, even more confusing given that the Heisei Era, and with it the Millennium Era, had retconned Showa in general. Even as a standalone project, that got weird. So, for now, Toho gave it a rest for quite some time. And not just Toho either, everyone gave Godzilla a rest. That 10-year break they wanted was finally here, and the first people to pick Godzilla back up again was actually the West. Toho didn't come back until 2016 in the Reiwa era. This is the most recent era, and the set I watched most recently as well. So I'll go over these in a bit more detail. It began with Shin Godzilla, or Godzilla Resurgence in the US, which is simultaneously the only live-action Godzilla of this era, and I loved it. It was fantastic. Look at this googly champ. This movie did very well in Japan, but not great in the West. Now, I'm not a film critic, and I will not pretend to be a film critic, but I am going to tell you why I think that is. The West sees the name Godzilla and thinks monster movie. What they think they'll see is constant out-of-breath individuals running away from monster attacks while they attempt to save their marriage and perhaps regain the love of their rebellious offspring. And Shin Godzilla is not that. Shin Godzilla is the most Godzilla movie since the first Godzilla movie. Because Godzilla is a stand-in for the real threat. Except this time around it isn't a bomb, but the dreadfully slow-moving wheels of bureaucracy and tradition. Let me first go through the movie with you, and while I warned of spoilers before, extra warning now. I'm about to spoil Shin Godzilla for you, and I'll tell you ahead of time, I really enjoyed this movie, so if you'd like to check it out yourself first, you might want to skip this chapter. Shin Godzilla is yet another reboot, and I do mean completely. Nobody knows about Godzilla yet. The movie opens on a boat, as tradition dictates, the Glory Maru. It's abandoned and only contains some research papers and the message, "Do as you please." Not long after that, Godzilla appears near Tokyo. This is where we're introduced to our main players. Rando Yaguchi, specifically. He's the Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary, a convoluted title on its own, and he's the only one who offers that the recent disasters may have something to do with a large living creature. He's laughed off, but proven right, of course. This is very much a main theme in this movie. The younger generation among the government officials will argue simply and to the point, or they'll offer up possible suggestions, and the older generation will either scoff at their remarks or tell them they're wrong, only to be proven a fool not long after. The Godzilla that appears is not a fully mutated Godzilla yet. It's the googly-eyed version who crawls onto land and rampages through the city streets face first. Every so often we'll see him attempt to raise himself up through use of a building, which topples almost immediately. After some time, this Godzilla collapses and begins to mutate, standing up on its hind legs, overheating, and rushing back to sea to cool off and mutate once more. At this point, as Godzilla leaves for the ocean, Japan calms down. Undeservedly, of course. During the attack, the government spent all of its time arguing over what to do, changing plans, setting up pointless press meetings, and in the end doing nothing at all. They took 2 hours to do nothing. They gave the call to evacuate too late, and Godzilla was still very much alive. They start to continue as usual while trying to find Godzilla, without success. The Americans also want a piece of the pie, of course, and it is revealed that the boat the movie opened with contained Godzilla research. Half of it, at least. The Americans had the rest, and now they must work together to find a way to defeat Godzilla, alongside the special unit set up by the Japanese government. And yes, the lady playing the American is about as American as me. This special unit is led by Yaguchi and contains nothing but the rebellious youth who likes to do things differently. And by that we mean quickly and to the point. They decide on a way to take out Godzilla and get to work, but before they can get anywhere, Godzilla re-emerges, this time stably on 2 feet. Nothing seems to harm the monster, and even when stealth bombers are sent in by the Americans, Godzilla simply destroys them with his newfound laser strength. I'm going to show you some of that scene right now because it was so good, and I loved it so much. Okay, carry on. So even though nothing works, Godzilla is eventually all fired out and takes a nap right here, giving the government time to act. The old cabinet has been largely blown up by Godzilla, and a completely unqualified minister is promoted to prime minister. Not that this says anything, because the last PM was doing terribly. Regardless, the US has decided to drop some nuclear bombs on Godzilla to stop the thing from moving, and the world just sort of agrees with that. They'll help them rebuild, they say. It's very obvious that the Godzilla franchise doesn't exist in this world, otherwise we would have unanimously yelled at them that this will only make him stronger. Sir, there's a gigantic creature firing atomic breath at our strongest weapons! What? It's firing atomic breath? Atomic breath, sir! Atomic breath? It won't stop using its atomic breath! Fire more atomic weapons at it! Yes, sir, Wait, hold on. What? It's an atomic creature, sir, very, very clearly. And do you not think that maybe an atomic bomb? An atomic bomb what, soldier? Nothing, sir. Absolutely nothing. Carry on. Thankfully, the attack never happens because Yaguchi and his team enact Operation Yashiori, where they spray coagulant into Godzilla's mouth that eventually freezes him solid, leaving him a statue in the middle of Tokyo as something of a reminder. On the tail tip, we can see several skeleton-like creatures emerging, and I personally got some extremely H.R. Geiger vibes from the whole image. I like this movie not only because it was so much closer to the origins of Godzilla, but while I like the rather cartoony movies the Godzilla franchise produced afterwards, this one felt like it said something more. Don't get me wrong, I love the monster versus monster movies. However, it's nice to finally see a Godzilla movie again that does more with the script than just that. Not to mention, it gave me some amount of insight into Japanese politics and the frustrations of the masses. The way the Americans constantly held the war and their influence over their head as if Japan wasn't allowed to make its own decisions was very poignant. The way Japan largely kept their heads down and did as it was told until the main protagonist decided it was enough was wonderful to see. They even acknowledged by the end that perhaps it's time Japan changes somewhat in how they do things, making the "do as you please" line that was left behind on the abandoned boat a very good send-off. I suppose that's only to be expected, as the directors for this movie also worked on Neon Genesis Evangelion. If they didn't have some sort of message, I'd be extremely surprised. And trust me, while I have just spoiled the plot for you, so to speak, even knowing what will happen, this movie is still worth watching because I didn't really have time to go through minute details. This movie is 2 hours long. You should absolutely watch it. Having said that, the other side of the Reiwa era is the animated series. It consists of 3 separate movies, each a continuation of the last. Planet of the Monsters, which focuses on humans, City on the Edge of Battle, which focuses on the Bilsaludo, and The Planet Eater focuses on the Exif. The latter 2 are alien races who visit Earth after Godzilla appears and trashes the entire place. We dubbed them the Ganondorf race and the Link race. Truly, Godzilla takes over the world. Initially, the 2 races pledged to aid humanity in their fight, and the Bilsaludo seem genuine in their efforts as they put together Mecha Godzilla, but they all fail in the end. Instead, they all escape into space, where they slowly lose their minds until they decide it's time to go back to Earth to fight Godzilla. The only reason they think they have a chance this time, after getting their collective behinds handed to them before, is Haruo Sakaki. He figured out Godzilla's weakness, and now they're going to exploit the heck out of it. Which they do successfully, and Godzilla explodes. Except that was Godzilla Jr., and the real Godzilla stands up after watching his son explode into a million pieces. Earth itself has also evolved to adhere to Godzilla's biology. The plants are violent, the rest of the wildlife is violent, and there's a cult of Mothra around who is a little violent, but only until they become allies with the humans. In this universe, Godzilla rose to fight because of pollution and the like, human society taking science too far and destroying the Earth, which is certainly in line with our generation's problems. So, the first movie is largely about that, and explaining the human situation. The second movie focuses on the Bilsaludo as we find Mechagodzilla's city. The Mechagodzilla built by the Bilsaludo all those years ago has continued to evolve itself using its super AI, and it's built a city of itself. Mechagodzilla never actually shows up, it's literally just a city. It's made of nanometal, which has the ability to absorb biological tissue and make it nanometal too. You can see where this is going. The Bilsaludo take things too far and want to be absorbed by Mechagodzilla's city to become more than just biological, and because it empowers the city itself, they try to force others to get absorbed as well. So while they almost defeat Godzilla, it goes too far for Haruo, and the plan breaks off. The third movie focuses on the Exif, and this one is completely off the rails. The deal with the Exif is that they're actually a suicide cult who go to planets where they try to make everyone sacrifice themselves to Ghidorah, so the Golden Dragon is summoned and it can eat the planet. They've been playing the long game, which is a really stupid game, because this comes completely out of the blue in the final movie, and there was no guarantee, ever, that humanity would ever return to Earth. Can you tell I'm not a fan of this movie? The Ghidorah in this movie is just 3 dragon heads coming out of black holes. They bite Godzilla, and they can't be touched at all until the main Exif is taken out, and once that happens, Ghidorah doesn't stand a shadow of a chance. You could technically explain that by saying Ghidorah was technically not in his own dimension, so maybe if he was, he'd be stronger, but as it stands, no cool monster fights. There isn't a single one in this whole 3-movie set. I'm not saying I specifically need cool monster action, but a little bit of cool monster action outside of the few opening moments of movie 1 would be great. Have I got the pitch for you? It's an animated Godzilla movie series. An anime? No, animated. I'm not allowed to call this anime, someone will hurt me. Oh, okay. What's the rest of the pitch? Well, Godzilla is going to take over planet Earth. Okay, I like it. And alien races come in to help us fight him. All right, I like where this is going. So everyone leaves. Wait, what? But then we come back. Oh, okay. Phew! And they're going to fight Godzilla again. Yeah, monster fights. No, there's only Godzilla. Only Godzilla? Well, kinda. Godzilla mostly just stands there anyway. Stands there. Stands there. Uh-huh. Anyway, all the way at the end of the third movie, Ghidorah comes in. Oh yeah, monster fights! No, Ghidorah just kind of limply bites Godzilla and then they hover for a bit. What? Yeah, the real fight is mental between 2 guys. No monster fights. Not really, no. And Godzilla just stands there for most of the movie. I mean, he fires some lasers from far away, and occasionally he sets a base on fire, which we totally see from far away. So we have a Godzilla movie without monster fights, a Godzilla who barely moves, spread across 3 parts that have an extremely flimsy setup purely so this new movie can happen, even though none of the characters' previous setup really lead up to it. Oh, I'm glad you could infer that last part. So you love it, right? I love it, this is Netflix gold. I can appreciate the underlying themes otherwise. Climate change, over-reliance on technology, the way humanity just generally takes things too far. They're valid things to discuss in a Godzilla movie, but they're all thrown in haphazardly, and especially the Exif part was just chaos. Characters that behave and believe one way in one movie completely change their character in the next, purely to fit the narrative, and it started to get incredibly grating. I just don't have too many great things to say about it. Even the animation isn't up to par. And Godzilla himself barely moves. There's just a lot of close-ups of his face. Generally, I thought the idea of Godzilla looking and feeling like a literal mountain rising up to defend nature was a neat idea. But neat ideas will only get you so far. Thankfully, we had Shin Godzilla. They're also gearing up to start another series called Godzilla Singular Point later this year, and this one looks like it's going to be in an anime style, so we'll see how that goes. And with that, we've had the last of the Japanese Godzilla eras. But not the last of Godzilla. Let's talk about the American movies. Now, let's finally talk about Godzilla 1998. The TriStar Pictures movie that saw everything fall apart around it. Directed by at least one guy who just didn't like monster fights. This movie is the reason Toho came out of early retirement in the Millennium Era. Ignoring the directorial and budget constraints of this movie, it just wasn't a Godzilla movie. They'd seen Jurassic Park, they'd seen the T-Rex and said to themselves, okay, we should get one of those. So they got the rights for Godzilla off Toho, reluctantly, and completely ignored the Godzilla bit of that deal. They made a very large T-Rex, and it was bad. This Godzilla was impressively weak. Not the lumbering beast that no missiles could stop, lest they're made of super awesome extra space nova diamond atomic metal, but instead a big lizard who runs away from the missiles a lot. Godzilla runs scared in this movie. Also, there's a bunch of eggs, so there's a lot of mini Godzillas, except they behave more like velociraptors because those were also very popular in Jurassic Park. On top of that, Godzilla dies in this movie with very little effort. I'm going to stop calling this creature Godzilla now because Toho bought the rights to this creature not long after the flop and officially renamed it Zilla, even though Sony initially had the rights to make a Godzilla 2. Fortunately, or unfortunately, they took too long to make it and their contract expired. I'll be honest, I was a little curious as to what they would have done with it, given that one of their antagonists would be called the Queen Bitch. No, I'm not kidding. And the thing is, as a not Godzilla creature, I think it's a neat monster. But since this creation didn't even have atomic breath, I kid you not, how can you even call it Godzilla? Aside from the bad plot, bad dialogue, and bad effects, I mean, actually no, include all of that. Because of all of that and the not Godzilla, this movie was bad. And Toho would continue to make fun of it for quite some time. In Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters, All-Out Attack, they mentioned there was a giant monster similar to Godzilla attacking New York recently, but it wasn't Godzilla. Definitely not Godzilla. And then they had the real Godzilla trash the Zilla monster in the blink of an eye during Final Wars. At least he got a bit more of a fair fight in the comics, but man, Toho hated this guy. Which is also why they weren't very keen on selling the rights to Godzilla in the West again, but Legendary Pictures convinced them again and started up the Monsterverse. And these I like. It started in 2014 with simply Godzilla. We discover Godzilla once more, this time explaining that the Godzilla race lived on Earth millions of years ago, when said Earth was more radioactive. This time his fight is against the Muto monster. These movies definitely focus more on the climate change and humanity as a bad influence in general angle, which I think is a good choice because it speaks to us a lot more these days than a nuclear war would. In the next movie, 2019's Godzilla King of the Monsters, my favorite out of these two, we get a whole host of Toho Universe monsters, Mothra, Rodan, and Ghidorah, as well as several originals in the form of, among others, Scylla, Methuselah, and Behemoth. Both Godzilla and Ghidorah battle over who gets to call themselves the true King of the Monsters. And when Godzilla wins, the other monsters, here called Titans, bow to his will. The monster fights are definitely a lot more prevalent here, and I'm so glad for it because watching these beasts fight with special effects like that is fantastic. The upcoming movie in this series is, of course, Godzilla vs. Kong, which I'm looking forward to quite a bit. There's been a lot of debate on how King Kong could possibly be a match for Godzilla at all, but come on. Have you not seen the original? He'll float into his face with balloons and then empower himself with lightning. At least I'm hoping for the balloon part. So where does all this leave Godzilla? Well, the Godzilla franchise has been around for as long as I live. Even if you'd never watched a Godzilla movie in your life, you knew who Godzilla was. There have been other contenders since the early days like Pacific Rim, which I also enjoy very much and I will die on that hill, but no one's ever come close to Godzilla's stature. It's so easy to see the beast as a force of nature that he's been used as a stand-in several times now, and perhaps it does represent a certain fear that one day the planet will simply have enough and quite literally spawn a beast capable of dealing with our absolute nonsense. Truth be told, getting stepped on by Godzilla would not be the worst way to go. By this point, the kaiju stories truly have evolved into post-apocalyptic imagery and alien fear alongside this idea that our planet is indeed capable of rising up against its captor. And in that sense, I even think Godzilla has somewhat found its horror roots again, in a way. From conception, he's been an atomic bomb, killed, found again, got a son, absorbed fire powers from Fire Rodan, died again to resurrect his dead son, and then he got another reboot. And I haven't even told you about the action figure exclusive Japanese television show because that exists and it's adorable. In fact, there were quite a few Godzilla TV shows like Godzilla the series that used the Zilla Godzilla version from the failed TriStar movie. Except this show was pretty good. I liked it. There was even a Godzilla cartoon created by the Hanna-Barbera studio. Yeah, the Flintstones one. There were several others, but a new one is in the works right now that looks to be a proper Godzilla anime, and I really hope it's good because I cannot tell you how much I strangely need that in my life. Honestly, it's almost strange to me that Godzilla hasn't had an anime adaptation before this time. And no, I do not count the Planet of the Monsters 3-parter because have you seen the animation? But I suppose now that the West has accepted him into our box office hearts, it's become a little easier to make profitable offshoots, and full glad am I for it. I don't think there's ever going to be a moment in time where the world forgets about Godzilla entirely. Some things are just too much of a staple for our world. Like Shakespeare, the Mona Lisa, or Mozart. Godzilla remains king of the monsters. Forever. Until another tale finds us. Yes, hello Bob, this is Jinsey from Eyewitness Proper Bird News. We have some reports of Godzilla's rampaging through the city behind me, as you can see. Several have already been stepped on, including, but not limited to, Wall Guy, the Robin. Unfortunately, a Robertson has also been trampled. Coolstaff, Septic, all stepped on. Flat as a pancake. Yes, Bob, you heard that right. Mike Sears has been atomic breathed in the meantime. Adrian Peckle as well, tripped on his foot, and then got atomic breathed, as they say. Bob, yes, behind me, as you can see. Ray and Freeman were unfortunately all shish kebabbed on a spike put there by Godzilla. How did Godzilla do that? Nobody knows. Back to you in the studio. Bob.